Hi everyone, Quiveen here from the comfort of my kitchen. In today's video, we are going to be looking at the constellations. And of course, I take a look at the constellations, or at least point out some constellations in almost every video, even if it's just what constellation the planet that we're focusing on is in. In this video, we're going to look at the constellations generally. We're going to look at the northern and southern hemisphere constellations, and we're going to take a look at the constellations that are in fact behind the sun. Of course, I'll have to translate these names back to Latin, but it's nice to see the English names as well. And taking a look at this broad view of the sky with all of these constellations visible, it should be clear that most of these are animals, and most of them are real animals. You know, even things that seem as strange as a flying fish. I'm not sure why the Dorado here is being called swordfish, because of course it's a Dorado, it's not a swordfish. It very much has the opposite of a sword here with its rounded face. The flying fish, also a real animal, the chameleon, the bird of paradise. These are all real things. There are various tools, inanimate objects, and there are a few inanimate objects that we would be familiar with here in the northern hemisphere. For example, Libra, we've got Triangulum, the triangle. There's not that many inanimate objects in the northern hemisphere. We've got Lyra, the lyre there as well. Down in the southern hemisphere, there's a lot more. For example, the engraving tool here, a chisel really. We've got the boat split up into its various pieces, the stern, the sails, the keel. We've got the phoenix, which is a mythological creature, and the centaur down here. The centaur that's actually called centaur, compared to Sagittarius, the centaur that is referred to as the bowman, which we have just around here. So Sagittarius, the centaur, Capricornus, the Capricorn, these are mythological creatures. Pegasus, of course, Cetus, all mythological creatures in the sky. If we bring these names back to Latin, back to the names that we would be more familiar with, that gives us the names as we would expect them. These different constellations, it is a little bit hard to select the constellations, but each different one of them has its own history. The vast majority of the constellations that we see in the sky do come from ancient Greek mythology, particularly the mythological characters like Perseus here, Andromeda, Pegasus. These are all from Greek mythology. Looking down into the southern hemisphere, of course, these constellations were not coined by the Greeks. Centaurus, or the centaur here, possibly an exception depending on how low you are on the planet. You can see some of these constellations from the northern hemisphere as long as you're sufficiently far south in the northern hemisphere. But many of the other ones, things like the toucan here, the microscope, Mensa, Ayers Rock, or Uluru, these things could not have been known to the Greeks. The Native American Indus here, these things could not have been known to the Greeks. So of course, these constellations must come later. But some of the constellations that we see in the northern hemisphere, like Camelopardalis and Coma Berenices, the Latin pronunciation, here we go, here's Coma Berenices or Coma Berenices, or Coma Berenices. Whether or not you pronounce these as an English approximation, according to ecclesiastical Latin or according to classical Latin, you can get various different pronunciations like Canes Venatici, Canes Venetici, Canes Venetici, all of these different possibilities. Some of these constellations, like Coma Berenices and Camelopardalis, they were added later. They are newer constellations. So to go through the constellations, Stellarium has a list of all of the constellations, and we can see them here, all 88 constellations. And by selecting them like this, well, unfortunately, they don't give that much extra information, but we know that those constellations that are down south would have been discovered later. So we're going to go through a few of these different constellations. Antilla here, it's called the air pump, but I think we can see here that this is in fact more of a gas lamp. This is one of the constellations that was added a little bit later to the 88 constellations that we now have as the official constellations. We have here the Altar, Ara, or Era. There's various ways to pronounce all of these constellations. As I mentioned, whether you're pronouncing them in English or in Latin, Coming up to the Archer, Sagittarius. Sagittarius is one of the older constellations. It's one of the constellations that was listed by Ptolemy. If we come here to the Arrow, Sagitta as well. Most of the older constellations were listed by Ptolemy, the ancient Greco-Roman astronomer who lived seemingly his whole life in Egypt near Alexandria. Alexandria was a Roman province after the Macedonian leadership, after the Macedonian pharaohs of Egypt. So the identity, the cultural identity of the ancient Greco-Romans living in Egypt does get, interesting. There's different ways to do it. Here we have Apus, the bird of paradise. Almost all of the constellations that we see in the southern hemisphere are newer. They're newer constellations. Taurus the bull, of course, one of the zodiacal constellations. That's a classic. The Carpenter's square here. It doesn't look like a square, of course, but it's a T-square. T-squares don't get used very often anymore, but as well as being useful for measuring, they're also useful for performing certain mathematical calculations like logarithms. And it is one of the devices that we see in the southern hemisphere. We can see another here just at the edge. Devices that were very, very useful to the early modern, pre-modern sailors who were doing the navigation down in the southern hemisphere. You'll notice that there are a lot of not just things that are emblematic of the southern hemisphere. Of course, centaurs aren't exactly emblematic of the southern hemisphere, but there's a lot of tools that were emblematic of navigation and naval tradition, which were very important to the people navigating in the southern hemisphere. Andromeda, the Chain Maiden, of course, a classic. The chameleon, which I'm sure most of us would agree would be better if it were pronounced chameleon, but chameleon is the standard pronunciation, another creature that wouldn't have been well known to the ancient Greeks. Here we go, Auriga, the charioteer, who is holding a goat, but there's a whole mythological story explaining why a charioteer is holding a goat and not associated with a horse. Here we've got the clock, horologium. I mentioned that clocks and accurate method of measuring the time was very important for solving the longitude or longitude problem. Figuring out your latitude, of course, isn't too hard. Figuring out your longitude, that is significantly more difficult. Cancer the crab, another one of the classical signs of the zodiac. Grus or Grus, the crane, is another one of the slightly newer constellations, and we can see it down here surrounded by constellations that are associated with the southern hemisphere. For example, Pisces Austrinus here, it is the southern fish. The Austrinus or southernness is right there in the name. Corvus, of course, a northern constellation, not a particularly famous one, but a particularly nice one. Coming around here to Crater, the cup. It is more of an urn or maybe almost like a trophy, but it is considered the cup. Delphinus, another reasonably old constellation. Another constellation that comes from the tradition of Ptolemy. The dove here, Columba. Doves were also associated with naval voyages and travel. This dove in particular is holding an olive branch in its beak, which is associated with a different mythology, not the ancient Greek one, but it was an important symbol for sailors. The idea that the dove would find land and bring back an olive branch to indicate that it had found land. Draco the dragon, I will zoom out a little bit, a huge constellation taking up a huge region of the sky. Not only were extra constellations added and older constellations taken away, but constellations had their size and shape changed as well, and we'll get to an example of that pretty soon. Here's Circinus, the drawing compass. So these kinds of compasses, they were important for figuring out distances. Compasses were used. This kind of compass, this two-pronged device, were used along with maps for navigation. The Eagle, Aquila, another gigantic constellation, another old constellation. The Chisel here, Calum, this is another one of the newer constellations that was added around the 1700s. Here is Hydra. So Hydra is the snake. Really, this is the female water snake. It's not the real Hydra, the many-headed Hydra of Greek mythology. It's a different kind of snake. There's Pisces, the fish, of course, another one of the zodiacal constellations, another one of those very famous constellations. We've got Musca, the fly. Flies, of course, maybe not the most well-loved animal, but they do feature here in the sky. They're a feature of the southern hemisphere, very close to the Southern Cross, as we can see here. Volans, the flying fish, we can see here it is with its wings spread. Flying fish are presumably really more gliders or ground effect flying things, more like an acranoplan than a bird or a plane. Here is Vulpecula, the fox. I always think of Vulpecula as the little fox because vulpes is usually the term for fox, but some of these words used alternate forms. Here's Fornax the furnace, and we can see here it's got this glass beaker on it. So although furnaces and fire kept in this way have existed for a very long time, this is specifically a chemical furnace or a chemist's furnace, something for heating up mixtures and reagents. So of course it is one of the more modern constellations as well, along with Camelopardalis. So there are new constellations in the northern hemisphere as well as the southern hemisphere, but there's a lot more of the ancient Greek constellations in the northern hemisphere because of course that was the sky that the ancient Greeks were familiar with. Ursa Major, one of the most famous, well, the Plough, the Big Dipper, really one of the most famous asterisms in the sky, but the Great Bear is another reasonably famous constellation. Canis Major, another very famous constellation, another old one. Lepus, the Hare, another very old constellation. A lot of the older constellations are these animals and mythical people. Here's Hercules wrestling with the actual Hydra, the actual giant snake, and a lot of the newer constellations are tools and more exotic animals, or more exotic from our perspective here in the north. There's Bootes, the herdsman or the goat herd, actually with a herding staff. I know it looks a lot like a spear, but it is, from what I've heard or what I've seen, it's intended to be more of a crook or a goad, something for use with guiding animals, poking them in the right direction. Perseus, just labelled as the hero. Of course, Hercules and Orion, or at least Hercules, were considered heroes as well. There's Orion the hunter and the hunting dogs. Canis Venatici or Canis Venatici, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it. Indus, the Native American, it's considered just the Indian, but we can tell, I'm sure, with the headdress and the clothing here that it is intended to be a Native American. And of course, although it is one of the newer constellations, that is a relative term and it still comes from the 1800s. Here we have part of the boat. So this is divided into Puppis, Vela and Carina, different parts of the boat, which was originally one constellation. So this is one of the newer constellations, but it was so big it had to be divided up. Here we've got King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, of course, next to each other in the sky. We've got Canis Minor, the small dog there, just next to Monoceros, the unicorn. We've got the little lion, Leo Minor, just next to the big lion, Leo. There we go. There's the big lion, Leo, a famous sign of the zodiac. Similarly, we have the little bear just next to the bear, Ursa Major with Ursa Minor. Leo isn't normally called Leo Major. Here's Aquilius. Even though it is only the head of the horse and there isn't a full-size normal horse in the sky, we only have centaurs and pegasi and other mythological creatures. Here's Lacerta or Lacerta, depending on how you like to pronounce it. This is the lizard, although it always reminds me more of a salamander. It looks to me, this drawing looks more like a salamander than a normal lizard. Lynx the lynx, another emblematic creature of northern Europe and Europe in general. Here's the Lyra, another inanimate object, one of the fewer inanimate objects that we have in the northern hemisphere. Virgo, the maiden, and maiden is one of the translations of Virgo, and it's the one that we normally do go with. The male water snake, Hydrus. This is the other water snake, the smaller water snake than Hydra, the female water snake. This is Hydrus, the male water snake, and we can see that that's very much a southern hemisphere constellation. We've got the mariner's compass. This is the actual compass, Pyxis, depending on how you pronounce it, maybe Pyxis. But this is an actual compass, the kind of compass that uses a magnet to point north, rather than the drawing compass that was also important for navigation. Here we've got microscopium, balancing out telescopium. Of course, telescopes and microscopes are modern inventions, so these are necessarily newer constellations. Here we've got Corona Borealis, one of the older constellations, along with the Southern Crown, another older constellation. So both of the crowns in the sky, they are a little bit older. This is the octant. It's similar to sextant, but it is a little bit different. Again, it's another navigational tool. We do have a sextant in the sky as well, along with the easel, the painter's easel. The painter's easel, of course, not a navigational tool, but close to the Renaissance. Back in the 1700s, of course, art was very important. Here we've got the peacock, pavo. Peacocks would have been known to the ancient Greeks, given that this is a peacock with its big tail, but peafowl, peacocks and peahens generally would have been known to the ancient Greeks, given that they are from India. They are from the northern hemisphere rather than the southern hemisphere. And the phoenix, of course, part of the mythology of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the phoenix, the mythology of it rising out of the flames, but one of the newer constellations added in around the 1600s as well. Aries the ram, another member of the zodiac, another very famous constellation. The reticle, so this is reticulum, the reticle. If we zoom in a little bit closer here, we can see that this is a circle with a cross on it. So a reticle is still commonly used as an aiming device. We still use it in astronomy. A reticle is really just something you look through with a guide in it to make sure that you're looking at what you're really looking at, to make sure that you're centered on it, because it has this spider, this cross in the middle that allows you to make sure that what you're looking at is centered. The river Eridanus or Eridanus, depending on how you pronounce it, and we can see that this river has people in it. So whether it's the river of dreams or the river of souls, there's a few different connections that get made with that river in the sky. The sails, coming back to the boat, there's Vela, the sails, part of this. It is a separate constellation, but it was derived from the constellation of the boat. There's Libra, another one of the older constellations, potentially not as old as Scorpius. As I mentioned in a previous video, according to the ancient Babylonian tradition, there was probably just one constellation here, a giant scorpion without the scales, them coming presumably later in Greek mythology. Here we've got the sculptor, another artistic constellation in the sky, like the artist's easel, another symbol of the artistry that was popular at the time. We have Capricornus, another one of the zodiacal constellations. Cetus, the sea monster. I always refer to Cetus as the great whale, and you can almost see the sort of lines on the lower jaw there, similar to the kind of lines that you get with baleen whales on their lower jaws. Here we've got Cassiopeia, the seated queen, the only queen in the sky, so we don't really have to distinguish that. Here we've got the serpents, often divided into serpens cauda and serpens caput, because they are separated by a fucus there in the center, or a fucus, the serpent bearer. Here we go, the 13th sign of the zodiac. We can see the knee just in between Sagittarius and Scorpius. The sextant, up here in the northern hemisphere, again a newer constellation, even though it's up here next to Leo and Hydra. So this is the sextant, again similar to but different from the octant, another navigational tool. Here we've got the shield, Scutum the shield, another one of the newer constellations, another one of the Hevelius constellations. Because only some people created maps of the night sky, those people who created the maps of the night sky, it was up to them what constellations they included or didn't include. So Johannes Hevelius included several constellations that weren't part of other traditions, and many of them became part of the modern official 88. There we can see the cross, the Southern Cross, very useful for navigation. And here we go, the Southern Crown, Corona Australis. Because Corona Australis and Corona Borealis are both older constellations coming from Ptolemy, it shows that some of the southern constellations, even the ones called Southern or Austral Australis, they are still older. So it's not a perfect division. And here we've got Pisces Austrinus, the southern fish just under Aquarius. Even though some of these constellations would have been visible to the ancient Greeks, there are still new constellations in the northern hemisphere, as I mentioned. There's the southern triangle, a much more even triangle, closer to an equilateral triangle rather than the right angle triangle that we have for triangulum. Here's the stern of the ship, Puppis, and we can see that this ship, it has this kind of prow here. It looks very similar to a galley of some sort with this single kind of rectangular or square sail. I'm not sure exactly what kind of boat it's supposed to be. Cygnus the Swan, part of the Summer Triangle, another very famous constellation. The Swordfish, I mentioned, this is a Dorado, not a swordfish, so I don't know why the English is being given as swordfish. It's a very different constellation. Similarly here with Table Mountain. Mensa just means table, but it is Mount Mensa, or Table Mountain, and in this case, of course, it's Uluru, the big red rock in Australia. Here we've got Telescopium. It's a terrible drawing of a telescope. The base of it here, the tripod in particular, doesn't look very good, but that's Telescopium, another one of the very important navigational tools. We've got the toucan here, also with a branch of some sort in its mouth, something that it shares with the dove but not with the crane, another southern hemisphere constellation. Coming back up to our triangle, Triangulum, and you can see very much a right angle triangle there. Of course, geometry was very important to the ancient Greeks. People like Pythagoras were from ancient Greece, and so there is a little bit of geometry in our northern sky as well. Gemini the twins, part of ancient Greek mythology, an easy one to tell, and they're in unicorn Monoceros. And I believe, no, yeah, we've got just a couple more left here. We've got the water bearer Aquarius. Yep, the winged horse, Pegasus. It's tough to remember that Pegasus is the winged horse. I think of it as Pegasus with a P, even though it's listed here as winged horse with a W. Similarly here for Lupus, the wolf being called the wolf rather than being called lupus down there in the just barely in the southern hemisphere. It's too far south for us to see here in Ireland, but it would be visible from other northern hemisphere areas, and that brings us to an end. So that's the constellations. That's all 88 of them. I used the list to make sure that I didn't forget a single one. You won't get to see all of those constellations. Nobody gets to see all of the constellations. Even if you're bang on the equator, there's going to be some constellations that you're just not going to catch, whether they're too far south or too far north. And of course, there's always going to be some behind the sun. But I hope that you get to see some of those constellations. This is the first time I've run through every single one of them on this channel, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this video, then please do like it. If you like this kind of content, then please subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you'd like to read some of this information, you can do so on my website, queevinscontent.ie. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you back here next time.